Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now, here's the problem. There has been an awful lot of Linux distributions that have released either in final form, release candidate form, or beta form over the last, 3 or 4 weeks since I last posted a video. In the busyness of life, I have been able to look at some of these distributions, but not nearly long enough to be able to create a fully formed, fully digestible video explaining all the ins and outs of these distros. So today, in an effort of catching up and climbing to the top of the pile of Linux distros that have been sitting in my inbox, I'm going to roll it all into one video. So, as of the beginning of May 2021, here's a quick news flash of some of the distros that have upgraded or have put out future release testing versions for some of the best Linux distributions on the planet, in my opinion anyway. So, first of all, I want to start out by saying that yes, I'm still running KDE Neon from the KDE Plasma desktop video that I made some time ago now. There's actually just so much that I still love about this desktop environment that I don't see myself switching anytime soon. However, there is stuff to talk about in the Linux distro world. We're going to start with, of course, the Ubuntu 21.04 release. And basically, yeah, it's another Ubuntu release. I would say the most important thing that this release brings to the table, in my opinion, is the fact that it is testing out for the first time Wayland Display Manager support as default. Apart from that, everything else is kind of just a rolled through upgrade, including the GNOME desktop, which while they've used a lot of the same packages from the GNOME 40 release in the desktop itself, in terms of the applications, the actual desktop shell is still held back at GNOME 3.38. And I believe this is in an attempt to hold the desktop in a familiar pattern until they can figure out how they're going to customize or take the GNOME desktop moving forward. Ubuntu has had its own desktop identity for a while now, so it's not surprising to see them take this direction with the Hirsute Hippo release. And that is just the main Ubuntu desktop. On a side note, it definitely strikes me just how I'm not going to say irrelevant. The Ubuntu desktop is not irrelevant because it backs so many of the excellent open source desktop operating systems that probably you run. However, just as a cursory glance at the Ubuntu homepage, if you go to ubuntu.com, you realize very quickly how much the desktop doesn't mean I don't know. I don't want to say it doesn't mean an awful lot, but you can definitely see that a lot of the marketing, press, innovation, and all of that kind of stuff seems to be directed towards where Ubuntu's strong suit is. And I could totally understand why that's the case, which is why the Ubuntu desktop, at least in 21.04, in my opinion, is worth a skip unless you are really keen to try and test Wayland on your hardware. However, if Wayland is your thing, chances are you've probably already looked up and started running Fedora Linux 34, because in the latest release of Fedora, they have made some key improvements to Wayland to allow a lot of the things that have been hard to do in the past. Things like fully enabling Pipewire. With Pipewire fully up and running on Wayland, we now have the ability to use things like OBS Studio and be able to pipe audio around the system, and it kind of does away with the cruftiness and sometimes instability of something like Pulse audio. So, as always, the Fedora desktop continues to march forward, and in terms of the Fedora workstation release, you can go and check out my video on GNOME 40 that I made when the beta of Fedora 34 dropped, because honestly, in terms of what the user experiences, there's not a whole lot that's different compared to that video. So the desktop environment of GNOME 40 for me personally isn't compelling enough and isn't flexible enough for what I like to do with my system. I appreciate what the GNOME team have achieved with GNOME 40. They've definitely improved the default shell, I think, by switching to a horizontal workspace. I did have some questions about how the trade-off was being made between new users and between existing GNOME shell aficionados. Chances are, it appears that most GNOME users are on board with the horizontal switch, and I haven't used it long enough to comment otherwise. I think it's nice. I think it's relatively polished. However, if you do run an NVIDIA graphics card like I do on my laptop, you're still kind of left out in the cold a little bit because through no fault of Fedora or Wayland or anyone else, NVIDIA is still dragging its feet with full driver support for the Wayland desktop, for the Wayland display server. So that leaves you stuck with X11 if you're wanting to use proprietary NVIDIA drivers. Now, I will say that the default Nouveau drivers that you can use on an NVIDIA graphics card with Wayland are a little sketchy still. I noticed some visual artifacting when I was using the final stable release of Fedora 34, so your mileage may vary. But just be aware, if you want Wayland and all those goodies, you're probably better served either on an Intel AMD graphics card situation, or you're better off using just the X11 desktop environment. Interestingly enough, they managed to, with all of the work that the Plasma desktop team have been putting into the KDE desktop environment, it is great to see that they have made the switch to include or to use the Wayland display server as default in Fedora with the KDE spin of Fedora. So that's nice to see. Moving right along, I did want to quickly highlight the Ubuntu MATE release because I feel like the Ubuntu MATE release keeps being able to add new and useful things to their desktop release, release after release. I have a soft spot in my heart for Ubuntu MATE. I think it's a great project, and I think a lot of other desktop users appreciate what Ubuntu MATE brings to the table. And this time around, they've solved one of the surface level bugbears that I've had with MATE for a while, and that is updating the overall look and feel to match what we find in Ubuntu. So they've got a lovely GTK theme that now works with both Ubuntu MATE's branding and the overall Ubuntu look and feel. They've gone the extra mile in terms of making that theme available for backporting it in a PPA to those who use Ubuntu MATE 20.04. They've made both the icon theme and the GTK theme available in the Snap store, so any Snap packages will respect that theming if you choose to use it. And they've also made sure everything from the icons to the colors to window controls work in both light and dark themes. Now, unfortunately, because of the fact that a lot of the other bits of the desktop are getting old, like the notification tray, they have switched to the Ayatana notification panel, which does mean that some of the older bits and pieces are being stripped out, which does lose some functionality occasionally. Also, it's worth mentioning that they've had to make some changes because of the panel. They've had to make some changes to some of the more complicated desktop layouts that come included with MATE. So they've had to change a couple of things with how the Mutiny or the Unity panel layout works, just so that they can keep it up and running. I think they're planning on making some further changes to kind of restore some of that functionality, but we shall see. Apart from that, yeah, there's not a whole lot else going on here. My advice with Ubuntu MATE is, if you're happy with Ubuntu Desktop 20.04 and you're using the MATE desktop on there, go grab the PPA, grab that new theme, and you're good to go. All right, coming on to pre-release news. First of all, Elementary OS 6 beta was available earlier this week, or actually almost a week ago in the time of the recording of this video, which means that they have a version which is stitched together for developers to look at and possibly build or rebuild or update their applications for the upcoming release. Now, the release announcement itself has got a lot to it, and thankfully the team at Elementary have been really verbose. They've been quite forthright with detailing a lot of the changes that are coming in Elementary OS 6. Now, I am probably not going to be making a video about the beta at this point, mostly because I guess Elementary is one of those projects where I like to leave it until the official release before I kind of get my first taste of it. It's one of the few projects that I do that for, to be honest. And so I'm excited to see when the final release comes through. I am hopeful that in the current climate and the fact that with all of the work that's been put into this release, I do hope that it hits with some good reception and some nice buzz, because I know a lot of people are excited about this project, but that excitement has been dimmed by the sheer length of time that's gone through between the initial release of Elementary OS 5, Juno, which was way back in 2018, 19, and this one, which here we are with based on Ubuntu 20.04, which is already a year old at this point. Is that relevant anymore is the question. And my theory is it's not relevant at all. I am running right now KDE Neon, which is based on Ubuntu 20.04, and I don't notice the fact that I'm running an old as kernel. Anywho, moving right along, we also have some release candidates available for openSUSE Leap, which is kind of like the long-term support release version of openSUSE. So expect an update to openSUSE Leap 15.3 very soon. Apart from just updated packages across the board to whatever the latest patched stable version of those desktop environments and their respective packages are, KDE Plasma 5.18, GNOME 3.34, XFCE 4.16, all those updates are available. So all of the Zipper command line fans up there, just do the good old sudo zipper doop and away you go. Finally, there is a release candidate for an updated version of Rocky Linux. Now, this is not one that I've looked into because it's not really in my space, but I realize that a lot of my viewers would appreciate the space that Rocky Linux now occupies in the open source world. With the news that CentOS OS, or rather CentOS, I tacked an extra OS there, was going to be going in a slightly different direction to what it traditionally was. Rocky Linux was a project that was born out of wanting to fill the need that CentOS had left behind. So, led by one of the founders of CentOS, Rocky Linux seems to be off to a flying start, and they've got some release candidates ready for testing as well. It's interesting to see just how quickly this project has taken off since December last year, and it already seems to be picking up steam. If you're looking for an alternative to CentOS 8 that needs one-for-one compatibility with Red Hat, then Rocky Linux might be a great place to start looking. Well, I think that'll just about wrap us up for this video. I know this was a quick one. Hopefully it was a quick one. And there's clearly a lot going on in the open source world. But honestly, while there are a lot of updates, there is not too much here that dissuades me or makes me think otherwise about the desktop that I'm already running. And chances are it's probably the same for you. Let me know in the comments below, what is a project or release that you are genuinely excited for in the comments below. Because right now, while it has been distro release season, it feels iterative. Am I wrong in thinking that? Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.